Please welcome to the stage His Excellency José Manuel Barroso, former President of the European Commission, and Her Excellency Roberta Metsola, President of the European Parliament.
Hello, everybody. Great pleasure to be here with my good friend Roberta Metsola. I just heard that you were in a panel about the United States. We are going to bring you something much more simple, the European Union. So Roberta Metsola, she's the President of the European Parliament. She's been a brilliant President. And so we are going to engage for 20 minutes of conversation about Europe and the European Union, and also how Europe positions itself in the wider world, including the United States. My first question to you, Roberta, is, first of all, thank you for coming. I know you have such a busy agenda now, and it's great that you could find the time in your visit to New York to have this moment. Very simple question. In terms of integration, are we going forward or backwards in Europe and European Union?
Well, one word, we're definitely going forward. If I would have looked back a couple of years ago, specifically before the pandemic and then Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, I would have had my doubts. But today, you find a European Union that has found its feet, that has had to manage by crisis, and bring together leaders that perhaps were reluctant in the past to do more together, realize that it's better to do things at a European level than on a member state level because they had no choice. And I think now we're in a very crucial moment, still with a war raging on our continent, but looking forward, questions being asked of us: will the European Union become larger? Who will be the new members of the European Union? My answer is it's time to reform, it's time to reboot, but definitely not at the cost of us becoming less integrated, but rather more.
Good. So in terms of, you said, to justify the more advanced level of integration, you've made a comment about crisis, so it's very interesting. So in fact, it seems to confirm the old saying of one of our founding fathers, Jean Monnet, in the 50s, who said the European community is going to be made through crisis and their successive responses to successive crises. But also, you also made a very interesting point, is that our countries, they need that European level so that they can count to defend their interests and their values. So it reminds me of another sentence of a former Prime Minister of Belgium who said, in Europe, all countries is small. The problem is that some have not yet noticed it. And that's why, in fact, we need that dimension. And I think it's important, namely for an audience here that to a large extent is American, to understand what is the rationale for further integration of Europe, including, and you also mentioned it, external crises like the war. So do you believe that this war of Russia against Ukraine is in fact deepening the European integration? And can you give me some examples about?
I would say one package after another of sanctions. Still a lot of loopholes, still a lot of things that need to be done. The fact that we've completely uncoupled from Russian gas when pre-24th of February 2022, we had some countries that were 100% dependent on Russia for gas. Three, that we now rely on each other in terms of being energy interdependent. We had energy islands. You know, you come from Portugal. We had for so long a question as to why the Iberian Peninsula is not connected in terms of a provider of energy to the rest of the continent. We have had to, if I can use this metaphor, press the pedal on further renewables. In other words, we have completely revolutionized the way how we have to stand up for each other. And, you know, I come from one of the smaller countries in the European Union, and it's not about the size of a country, but it is about an understanding that there are certain things that you cannot do alone. I don't know whether we'll have time to talk about migration crisis. This is a case in point, where countries look to the European Union and say, we need solutions at a European level. And then finally also, you know, I travel a lot in neighboring countries, so with Ukraine, Moldova, Western Balkans, you see populations in those countries that look, especially their younger generation, as having no other better option than Europe. And that's a responsibility for us. And I have always believed the transformative effect of the path that a country goes through, from being a candidate country, from being on the list to enter, to becoming a member country, how much of a difference that makes, how much of an opening that gives to the younger generation. And eventually, you know, Europe is not just an economic bloc, but it's also a geopolitical security question that we're facing, especially today. So I would definitely say that the future, while the present is very difficult, but the future can only make us stronger.
So yes, but if you could so focus a little bit more on the direct consequences of the war that was launched by Russia against Ukraine. So you've mentioned it was impressive the number of package of sanctions that were supported by the European Union. And in fact, for that, we need unanimity, so it was possible. Secondly, also to reduce the dependence on Russian gas was amazing. In fact, on such a short period of time, countries that were, some of them dependent almost 100% on Russian gas, now they're no longer dependent. And I remember middle of last year, people were saying, oh, Europe will not be able to go through this winter because there is not enough reserve capacity. Germany is very dependent. In fact, Germany has been able to do that. But also now specifically in terms of defense. And you also said, Roberta, that, okay, we are now a geopolitical, so because Europe, everybody agrees that Europe is a very important economic power global. I will usually say, remembering my experience leading the Commission in G20, that in fact the three main global powers in economic terms is the United States, China, and European Union. With all respect, the others come a little bit behind. So from Japan to India to others. This is the three poles of economic power in the world: European Union, United States, and China in trade and so on. But geopolitically, is this war in Ukraine making something to happen in the more diplomatic and specific on defense dimension?
You know, we used to talk a lot about strategic autonomy before the invasion, with, I would say, 27 countries, 27 different interpretations of what strategic autonomy meant. And that's quite normal in the European Union in terms of interpretation of what we would call, you know, the same phrase everywhere. But if there's one thing that we've learned, and it took a while, but I think we've managed, is that we have to work with allies. And if you see, you know, how we are lockstep with the United States, I would also talk about the most recent G20, where the BRICS countries were brought in, where African Union was represented in a situation of where let's no longer talk at other countries, but with other countries, and that's a big responsibility of us in the European Union. But it's also a question of us being closest to the war has made us lead in terms of understanding that we need to spend more on defense, understanding that we need more domestic arms production. How self-sufficient are we? We talk about a defense union, for example, which would complement and not compete with NATO. Some countries are not NATO members. We have to talk also about the fact that only 7 out of 31 NATO countries spend up to the 2% defense requirement, with governments having had no choice but to say we are committed because we have no choice. We have 2 new NATO countries. So in this sense, I think Europe has led politically, but also within the G20, with the statements that have come out of that, with the fact that we are the ones who day after day are taking political decisions, with 7 million Ukrainian refugees on our continent still being hosted, with our external borders, whether they are sea borders to the south or land borders to the east, being under constant pressure. I mean, let's not forget Belarus, you know, hybrid migration tactics, what is happening in Moldova, vulnerability, big vulnerability there. We will have President Erdogan on this stage in a few minutes. I mean, what kind of new relationships and discussions do we have? And you mentioned China. I think this is where we have very much identified a policy, as we call it, you know, de-risking, not decoupling. What does that mean? It also means that we cannot lose our competitiveness as a European Union at the face of probably being squeezed out by the US and China, and that's one of our biggest challenges, I would say.
I was in China 3 weeks ago. In fact, I was received by the Premier Li Qiang, by the Finance Minister, Deputy Foreign Minister, by the whole government. Very impressive. And of course, among other takeaways from that visit, it was quite clear that they expect Europe to be a little bit different from the United States. So there is clearly on the Chinese rhetoric, and even when they speak with us directly, they try to see Europe not exactly in the position of the United States. Now, a little bit more difficult question for you. How do you position European Union in this, let's say, triangle, if you can call it, US, China, European Union? Should we be aligned with the Americans, our American friends and partners? Should we try to find some way between? How do we position Europe in this issue of decoupling? As you said rightly, it was in fact European Union who created the expression de-risking. When the motto coming from Washington was more or less decoupling, Europeans were the first to say, okay, de-risking, not full decoupling, but some de-risking. But that is, you also mentioned NATO. Most European countries are members of NATO. Most NATO countries are members of the European Union. So, in fact, we are embedded in NATO. So, can the European Union have some relatively autonomous role in relations with China, separate from the United States?
I think we also talk about, and I'll bring this in because I see we have only 8 minutes and I really want to do this. We're currently embarking on an unprecedented green and digital transition. And this relates to how we interact with our allies. We also need to bring in Latin America, specifically for critical raw materials. Our companies are dependent on these materials that are imported from different countries, not least China, right? Mm-hmm. We talk about, if I would say full dependence in some areas for our technology. How do we balance being the most climate ambitious continent on this planet while still remaining competitive, while still making sure that we have that safety net for our industries to survive, and making sure at the same time that we don't enter a subsidy protectionist race to the bottom. So one example, creation of a critical raw materials alliance, crucially important. Our Latin American partners said, why have you not spoken to us about this yet? Our African partners, why do we only talk about what you take, rather how we debate together about global allies? 3, when we are going to be discussing all of this political decisions and the laws that we make, do we manage to not price out our younger generations from being able to survive in an economy where interest rates are extremely high because we need to combat inflation? So I'm bringing all this in because it is not about a zero-sum game with the United States or with China, but it is about how we identify our leadership, continuing to remain competitive, while at the same time not entering a protectionist race to the bottom. The Inflation Reduction Act, our response from a digital perspective, from the Net Zero Industry Act, this is all legislative instruments that we're working on in the European Parliament. We've actually also, as an institution, and I'm proud to say as its president, that we have had to completely revolutionize how we pass legislation in Europe. How can we be ahead when we talk to our US counterparts, but also other counterparts on AI, on the CHIPS Act, on the fact that we are going to make sure that our industries, where we are still leaders, not many industries or sectors where we are leaders, but a clean tech revolution is definitely our aim. So if we can manage, and I say this obviously because we are looking at an election across the European Union in June next year, where we're going to have to be looking at our citizens and say, have we managed to address despite the crisis after crisis, the fact that there is a possibility for you to continue believing in politicians at European level taking decisions that you can believe in. And my last word would be that the worst thing we could do is, even in the context of these discussions or the impact of our decisions, is that we lose our citizens, that our citizens are no longer able to pay their bills, or our young people are priced out because of the fact that we've lost sight not only of the bigger picture, but each individual that requires us to protect them. And that is where every discussion we have across the table with all our allies has to keep our human-centric approach at the very center of it.
Yes, but as you rightly said, you mentioned how dependent we are from, let's say, other parts of the world, including, by the way, Latin America and Africa. And so it seems to me clear that this competition that is only increasing between the United States and China certainly is having a major effect all over the world, and that Europe is also thinking geopolitically more because of this, including in terms of rare materials. I don't know if you have noticed, but it was interesting. As a response of some restrictive measures that Europeans took regarding China, by the way, also following the executive order of President Biden here, the Chinese, they have put an embargo on exports to Europe of two rare materials, germanium and gallium. In Latin, it means Germany and France. So it's probably a coincidence. I asked them about that when I was there now, and of course they smiled. Why did they choose those materials? Anyhow, so this is in fact a world where we are seeing the over-politicization of everything, including the supply chains. Everything is now under review. And of course, Europe, 27 countries, sometimes it takes more time to take these decisions, but at least that's my personal opinion after leading the European Commission for 10 years. It's incremental, it's fragmented, it's step by step, sometimes small steps, but sometimes bigger steps, like the ones you've mentioned. So the pandemic has made Europe do things that before was unthinkable, like, for instance, the common debt that now we have, the Next Generation EU with 800 billion European euros. Or the progress that we have now also in terms of defense that was unthinkable. Not only Finland and hopefully Sweden joining NATO, but also Denmark had an opt-out on European defense and they joined European defense. So, and that was not so much mentioned by the media. So I take from your comments that you are in fact confident on the future of the European integration. At the same time, I think realistic about the challenges and difficulties. And I was trying to resist, but I cannot resist, to conclude a more political thing, because the previous panel, it was about who is going to win the elections in the US, Biden or Trump or someone else, but those were the names mentioned. Now, I'm not going to ask you for names or the possible consequence of a victory of Trump in Europe. I'm not going to put that question. But in European terms, because you have political families in Europe, which one you believe is going to win the next elections? The center-right, you belong to the European People's Party, the center-right, or the left, or the Eurosceptics? What is your take and what can you share with us about who is going to lead the European Union in the next 5 years after 2024?
Well, it's interesting, you know, I have 4 children and my eldest will vote for the first time next year. And he asked me the same question, like, so, Mom, you know, should I vote for you?
I'm like you compare me with your child.
Should I? He looked at me like, Mom, should I vote for you? Are you going to win? And I was like, well, I definitely hope you do vote for me. But secondly, I had to explain to my son that Europe is not, you know, a black and white or a red and blue scenario. It is about a coalition of the willing, if you will. It is a constructive pro-European center, of which my political background, together with the Liberals and the Socialist and Democrat group, form part, which will have to sit down next 10th of June next year and say, are we willing to use this majority to go forward, to continue on this ambitious plan that we have? Will it be easy? Absolutely not. Is it possible? Absolutely. If we manage to counter a very easy Eurosceptic narrative that grows on either side of the political extreme. And if we manage to counter that narrative, we can form a majority. It will take, I always say, politics is about ideology, it's about principles, it's about a good campaign. This will be my 5th one. But it is also about who can speak to each other across the table. And it's that table that hopefully becomes a little bit narrower than some we've seen over the past years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very, very clear. So namely for our American friends and those that are less familiar with European complexities, so the main takeaway is Europe will be led by a great, great coalition. So it's complicated,
Of
but
the willing.
Coalition of the willing, the willing Europe. So in Germany they say Groß Koalition. So Groß Koalition for the future. It's complicated, but at the end it works. Thank you very much, Roberta.
Thank you.
It was great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.